The stagecoach rattled violently as it crested the final hill before Sierra Vista, Wyoming Territory, 1873. Inside, Penelope Forrester clutched her worn leather satchel against her chest, knuckles white with tension as the coach lurched over a particularly deep rut. Her pale blue traveling dress, once crisp and proper when she'd left Boston 3 weeks ago, now hung limply on her slender frame, creased and stained from the arduous journey west. "Last stop before winter, miss," the driver called down, his voice barely audible above the howling October wind. "Sierra Vista ain't much, but it's all you're gonna see until spring thaw." Penelope nodded, though no one could see her. The knowledge that she was truly at the end of the line settled over her like the gathering storm clouds above. There would be no turning back, no second chances. Her uncle's letter had been clear. This position, as the town's new schoolteacher, was her last hope after the scandal that had forced her from Boston. The first flakes of snow began to fall as the stagecoach pulled into Sierra Vista, a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings stretched along a single muddy street. Penelope's heart sank. This desolate outpost, nestled in the shadow of the Wind River Range, looked nothing like the promising frontier town her uncle had described in his letters. The coach rolled to a stop in front of what appeared to be the town's only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read, "Sierra Vista Inn." As the driver opened the door, the biting wind whipped inside, stealing her breath. "Miss, we've arrived," he said, extending a weathered hand to help her down. Penelope stepped onto the muddy street, her city boots immediately sinking into the cold muck. She shivered, pulling her woefully inadequate coat tighter around her shoulders as the driver unloaded her trunk. "Your uncle said he'd meet you here," the driver said, setting down her trunk with a thud that seemed to echo her sinking hopes. "Yes, thank you." Penelope pressed a coin into his palm, then turned to survey the dismal town that was to be her new home. The street was nearly deserted, most sensible folks having already sought shelter from the incoming storm. A lone figure on horseback caught her attention, a man riding slowly toward the stagecoach station. As he drew closer, Penelope could make out broad shoulders beneath a worn sheepskin coat, and a cowboy hat pulled low against the wind. The horseman dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his chestnut mare to the hitching post. He approached with purposeful strides, removing his hat to reveal a shock of dark hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Miss Forrester?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant, carrying easily over the moaning wind. Penelope nodded, fighting to keep her teeth from chattering. "Yes, I'm waiting for my uncle, Edward Matthews." A shadow passed over the man's face. "I'm Samuel Caldwell. I run the Circle C ranch outside of town." He paused, his expression softening with what appeared to be pity. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Your uncle passed away 3 days ago." Pneumonia took him quick. The world seemed to tilt beneath Penelope's feet. Uncle Edward gone. Her last living relative, her only connection in this God-forsaken wilderness, the man who had promised her safe haven and a fresh start, dead before she'd even arrived. I don't understand," she stammered, though she understood all too well. She was alone, truly alone now, in a strange town on the edge of nowhere, with winter bearing down like a hungry wolf. Samuel Caldwell watched her carefully, noting how she swayed slightly but refused to fall. "Your uncle was a good man. He spoke often of his niece coming to teach our children." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm's moving in fast. We need to get you situated." Penelope fought to maintain her composure. "The teaching position, is it still available?" "It is," he confirmed. "Town's been waiting on a proper teacher for months." "Then I shall fulfill my commitment," she said, squaring her shoulders despite her exhaustion. I just need to find lodging until I can move into the teacher's quarters. A snowflake landed on Samuel's cheek as he frowned. That's the other problem. The schoolhouse isn't finished. Your uncle was overseeing the construction. Penelope felt the last of her hope crumbling. I see. Samuel studied her for a long moment, seeming to reach some internal decision. Miss Forrester, I made a promise to your uncle before he passed. Told him I'd look after you if he wasn't here when you arrived. He cleared his throat. I've got a cabin on my property. It's small but solid. You'd be welcome to stay there until the schoolhouse is complete. Penelope stared at him, stunned by the offer. Accepting lodging from a male stranger, would have been unthinkable in Boston. But this wasn't Boston, and she had nowhere else to go. That's very kind, Mr. Caldwell, but I couldn't possibly. Your uncle trusted me, he interrupted gently. And there's nowhere else in town that's prepared for winter. The hotel's roof leaks something fierce, and the boarding house is full up with miners who came down from the hills. As if to emphasize his point, the snow began falling harder, driven sideways by the strengthening wind. Penelope shivered violently. My ranch hands' wives can serve as chaperones, Samuel added, seeing her hesitation. You'll have your privacy and propriety. I give you my word as a gentleman. Penelope looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. She found none, only straightforward concern and an integrity that seemed as solid as the mountains looming over the town. Very well, Mr. Caldwell. I accept your offer, at least until other arrangements can be made. Samuel nodded, then gestured to her trunk. Let's get you and your belongings loaded up before this storm gets any worse. He lifted her heavy trunk with surprising ease, securing it to the back of his wagon that was parked nearby. She hadn't even noticed it in her distress. Penelope climbed onto the wagon seat, grateful when Samuel handed her a thick buffalo robe to wrap around her shoulders. As they pulled away from the town, the snow falling heavier with each passing minute, Penelope cast one last glance back at Sierra Vista. She had arrived on the last stage before winter, with nothing but uncertainty ahead. It's about 4 miles to the ranch, Samuel said, breaking into her thoughts. We should make it before the worst hits. The journey to Circle C Ranch passed in relative silence, both of them leaning forward against the driving snow. Penelope was struck by how quickly the town vanished behind them, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Wyoming frontier. The landscape was both terrifying and breathtaking, rolling plains giving way to distant mountains, all gradually disappearing under a blanket of white. By the time they reached the ranch, the light was fading and the snow had accumulated to several inches. Through the curtain of white, Penelope could make out a substantial main house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, and several smaller cabins scattered around the property. Home, Samuel said simply, guiding the wagon to a stop near the main house. 2 dogs bounded through the snow to greet them, followed by a middle-aged woman wrapped in a heavy shawl who emerged from the house. Martha, Samuel called out, this is Miss Penelope Forrester, Edward Matthews' niece. Oh, the poor dear, Martha exclaimed, hurrying forward. Come inside before you catch your death. Within minutes, Penelope found herself in front of a roaring fireplace, a cup of hot coffee pressed into her hands, as Samuel explained the situation to Martha and her husband, George, who served as the ranch's foreman. The cabin by the creek is ready, Martha said. I've kept it clean and the chimney draws well. She'll be comfortable there. I'm sorry for your loss, miss, George added kindly. Your uncle was a fine man. Thank you, Penelope murmured, the reality of her situation finally sinking in fully. She was at the mercy of strangers in a wild, unforgiving land, with winter settling in around them like a siege. After a warm meal that Penelope barely tasted despite her hunger, Samuel drove her to the promised cabin. It was indeed small but solidly built, with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed covered in colorful quilts, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves stocked with basic supplies. "It's not much," Samuel said apologetically as he lit the lamps and stoked the fire Martha had prepared earlier. "But it's warm and dry." "It's more than I expected," Penelope replied honestly. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, Sam," he corrected. "Out here, formality doesn't last long against practicality." For the first time since arriving, Penelope felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Then I suppose I'm Penelope." He nodded, a hint of warmth softening his weathered features. "Get some rest, Penelope. Martha will check on you in the morning." He paused at the door. "And don't worry, we take care of our own in Wyoming. Your uncle knew that. You're not alone here." With those words, he left, closing the door firmly against the howling storm. Penelope stood in the middle of the cabin, listening to the wind and the crackling fire. She should have felt terrified, abandoned, lost, and part of her did. But another part, a part she barely recognized, felt something else. Something that might, given time, resemble hope. She had arrived on the last stage before winter. And somehow, against all odds, she had found shelter from the storm. The next morning dawned blindingly white, the world transformed by nearly a foot of snow that glittered like diamond dust in the early sunlight. Penelope woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the unfamiliar weight of homespun quilts and the scent of wood smoke brought reality rushing back. Uncle Edward was dead. She was alone on a ranch in the Wyoming territory, and winter had arrived with a vengeance. A knock at the door startled her fully awake. Hurriedly pulling on her dress from yesterday, the only one readily accessible, she called out, "Just a moment, please." Martha's friendly face greeted her, arms laden with a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Brought you some breakfast, dear." "And some proper clothes." She bustled inside, setting the basket on the table. "Samuel's wife was about your size. He thought you might make use of her things." "Samuel's wife?" Penelope asked, accepting a steaming cup of coffee gratefully. Martha's expression softened. "Emma. Passed 4 years ago in childbirth, along with the baby. Hit him hard, but he's a strong one, our Sam." Penelope absorbed this information silently. So the stoic rancher had known loss too. Perhaps that explained the gentleness beneath his rugged exterior. "These should keep you warmer than those city clothes," Martha continued, unpacking several woolen dresses, a heavy coat, and sturdy boots. Emma was practical, but she liked pretty things too. Had these made in Denver the year before she passed. The dresses were indeed practical, but featured thoughtful details, embroidery at the collar of one, delicate buttons on another. Penelope ran her fingers along the soft wool. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Martha interrupted firmly. "They're no use to anyone packed away, and you'll freeze to death in what you brought." She softened her words with a smile. "Besides, Samuel insisted, said Emma would have wanted it." After breakfast, Martha helped Penelope unpack her trunk, clucking disapprovingly at the fashionable but wholly impractical Boston garments. By midday, Penelope was dressed in one of Emma's dresses, a deep green wool that complemented her auburn hair, with thick stockings and boots that actually kept out the cold. "There," Martha said approvingly. "Now you look like you might survive your first Wyoming winter." "Samuel wants to show you around the property once you're settled. Says there's some things you should know if you're to be teaching the children hereabouts." The tour of Circle C Ranch was eye-opening. Despite the snow, the operation hummed with activity. Ranch hands moved between barns and corrals, tending to horses and cattle. A smith's hammer rang out from a workshop, and smoke rose from several chimneys across the property. Samuel was waiting for her by the main house, his tall frame silhouetted against the snow-covered mountains beyond. He turned as she approached, and Penelope was struck by a momentary flash of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, at seeing her in his late wife's clothing before his expression returned to its usual reserved calm. "The green suits you," he said simply. "Are you ready to see the place?" Over the next 2 hours, Samuel showed Penelope every aspect of the ranch, the main house where he lived, the bunkhouse where the unmarried hands stayed, the various workshops and barns, the cookhouse where meals were prepared for the workers, and the small cabins where married hands lived with their families. "There are 8 children on the ranch old enough for schooling," he explained as they walked. 4 more from the neighboring spreads and 6 from town. They've been getting by with lessons from Martha and the preacher's wife, but it's not enough. 18 students, Penelope mused. A good number to start with. They're eager to learn, Samuel said, a hint of pride in his voice. Some of the older boys can only attend when ranch work allows, but they're smart, quick with figures especially. They stopped at a small rise overlooking the property. Despite the cold, Penelope was warm in her borrowed clothing, her cheeks flushed from the exercise and fresh air. "It's beautiful," she admitted, taking in the vast landscape. "Different from anything I've known, but beautiful in its own right." Samuel's gaze remained on the distant mountains. "It can be harsh," he warned. "Winter's long here, isolating. Springs are muddy, summer's too short, and autumn's barely a breath before the snow flies again." He turned to face her directly. "Many Easterners don't last their first year." "I'm not many Easterners," Penelope replied with more confidence than she felt. "And I have nowhere else to go." Something flickered in his eyes, curiosity perhaps. "Your uncle mentioned you'd had some trouble in Boston." Penelope stiffened. "Did he elaborate?" "No, Edward wasn't one for gossip." She nodded, relieved but also somehow disappointed that she couldn't simply lay her past bare and be done with it. "It's not a story worth telling," she said finally. "Merely the usual tale of a woman discovering the hard way that her value depends entirely on her reputation, deserved or not." Samuel studied her for a long moment. "Out here, your value depends on what you can contribute, how hard you work, whether you keep your word." A slight smile softened his features. "Reputations matter less than actions." "Is that a promise, Mr. Caldwell?" "Sam," he corrected again. "And yes, it is." The days fell into a rhythm as November deepened. Each morning, Penelope rose early, dressed in Emma's practical clothing, and walked the snowy path to the main house for breakfast. There, she joined the ranch family, Samuel, Martha, and George, and whichever hands were eating at the main table that day. After breakfast, Samuel and the men would head out to tend to the cattle and horses, while Penelope spent her mornings with Martha, learning the practical skills she'd need to survive in Wyoming. She learned to bake bread in the massive kitchen stone oven, to preserve meat, to mend clothing far more efficiently than her fancy Boston stitches had allowed. In the afternoons, she began teaching. With the schoolhouse in town still unfinished, Samuel had cleared space in a storage building near the main house, installing a small stove, benches, and a makeshift blackboard. The ranch children came every day, while those from neighboring properties came when weather permitted. Penelope discovered she loved teaching more than she had expected. These frontier children, though lacking formal education, possessed a practical intelligence and eagerness to learn that made her lessons a joy rather than a duty. They asked questions her Boston pupils would never have conceived, viewing education not as an obligation but as a precious opportunity. As December arrived, bringing shorter days and deeper snow, Penelope found herself watching for Samuel's return each evening. He often joined her in her cabin after supper, bringing books from his surprisingly extensive library or simply sitting by her fire, whittling while she marked student work. "You're good with them," he remarked one evening, watching as she reviewed a composition written by 12-year-old Timothy, the son of one of the ranch hands. "The children, I mean, they respect you." "They're wonderful students," Penelope replied, setting down her pencil. "Especially considering how sporadic their previous education has been." Samuel nodded, his hands continuing their careful work on a small wooden horse. "Education matters out here, though some don't see it. Not just reading and ciphering, though that's important, but learning to think, to question, to solve problems." "You're a surprising man, Samuel Caldwell," Penelope said before she could stop herself. "Not many ranchers I've met value education so highly." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Not many Boston school teachers could adapt to ranch life the way you have." Their eyes met across the small table, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual recognition, perhaps, of finding unexpected qualities in the other. Penelope felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the door. George stood outside, his expression grave. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got trouble, boss. 3 of the yearlings broke through the ice on the North Pond. We've got 2 out, but the 3rd is struggling." Samuel was on his feet instantly. "I'll be right there." He turned to Penelope. "Don't wait up, this could take hours." She nodded, suddenly afraid for him. "Be careful." "The ice, I will," he promised, something softening in his eyes at her concern before he followed George into the night. Penelope slept poorly, waking at every sound, imagining Samuel plunging through ice into freezing water. When dawn finally broke, she dressed quickly and hurried to the main house, nearly colliding with Martha in the doorway. "Is he?" she began. "He's fine," Martha assured her, though her expression was troubled. "They saved the yearling, but Sam was in the water too long. He's fighting a fever." Penelope's heart clenched. "May I see him?" Martha studied her for a moment, then nodded. "He's in his room upstairs. Been asking for you," though he'd never admit it. Samuel's bedroom was Spartan but comfortable, dominated by a large 4-poster bed where he lay, his normally tanned face pale except for 2 spots of color high on his cheeks. He turned when Penelope entered, his eyes brightening despite the fever. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough. "Not proper." "Propriety matters less than actions," Penelope replied, echoing his own words as she moved to his bedside. "Martha says you're being a difficult patient." A ghost of his usual smile touched his lips. "Never was good at staying still." He tried to sit up, wincing visibly. "Don't," Penelope admonished, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The heat of his skin radiated through his nightshirt, alarming her. "You need rest." "Can't rest," he muttered. "Too much to do. Winter feeding starts today." "George has it well in hand," she assured him. "Your job right now is to recover." He seemed about to argue further when a coughing fit seized him, harsh and deep. Penelope supported him through it, then helped him sip water from the bedside pitcher. As the coughing subsided, Samuel caught her hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply, his gray eyes holding hers. "For what? Being here, caring." His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it, whether from weakness or emotion she couldn't tell. "Of course I care," Penelope said, surprising herself with her honesty. "You've given me a home when I had none." His fingers tightened around hers. "Not charity," he murmured, his eyelids growing heavy as exhaustion overtook him. "Never that. You belong here, Penny. Like you were always meant to come." He drifted into sleep, still holding her hand, leaving Penelope to wonder at his words and the way they made her heart flutter like a captured bird. For the next 3 days, Penelope divided her time between teaching and caring for Samuel. His fever rose and fell, bringing with it moments of clarity followed by periods of delirium where he sometimes called for Emma or spoke to people long gone. During one such episode, he gripped Penelope's hand with surprising strength. "Don't leave," he pleaded, his eyes focused on something beyond her. "Not again. Can't lose you twice." "I'm right here," she soothed, uncertain whether he was seeing her or his departed wife. "I'm not going anywhere." On the 4th day, the fever broke. Penelope entered his room to find Samuel sitting up in bed, clear-eyed and alert, if still weak. His smile when he saw her sent a rush of relief through her so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You look terrible," she said, trying to hide her emotion behind teasing. "You look beautiful," he replied simply. By Christmas Eve, Samuel had recovered enough to join the celebration in the main house. The entire ranch gathered for a feast that, while lacking the fancy trimmings of Boston holiday parties, more than made up for it in warmth and genuine joy. The main room was decorated with pine boughs and handmade ornaments, and candles glowed from every surface. Penelope, wearing the best of Emma's dresses, a deep blue wool with subtle embroidery at the collar, and cuffs, found herself seated beside Samuel at the head of the table. As plates were passed and glasses filled, she was struck by how comfortable she felt among these people who had been strangers just 2 months ago. After dinner came gifts, practical items mostly, but given with such obvious thought and care that each seemed precious. Martha presented Penelope with a beautiful knitted shawl, while George had carved her a set of bookends. From the children came handmade tokens, drawings, a woven bracelet, a clumsily whittled wooden heart. When the common gifts had been exchanged, Samuel cleared his throat. "Penelope, would you join me on the porch for a moment?" Curious, she followed him outside. The night was clear and bitterly cold, stars blazing overhead with an intensity she'd never seen in Boston's smoky skies. Their breath formed white clouds in the still air. "I have something for you," Samuel said, suddenly seeming almost shy. From his pocket, he withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "It's not much, but—" Penelope unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small wooden box, exquisitely carved with delicate flowers and vines. When she opened it, a sweet melody played a music box. "It was my mother's," Samuel explained. "She brought it from Philadelphia when she came west with my father, said it helped her feel less alone during that first hard winter." Penelope traced the carvings with her fingertip, deeply moved by the personal nature of the gift. "Samuel, I can't possibly accept this. It's a family heirloom." "I want you to have it," he insisted gently. "You are." He paused, seeming to search for words. "You've brought music back to this place, Penelope, in more ways than one." The emotion in his voice made her look up, and what she saw in his eyes stole her breath. Before she could respond, the door opened behind them, spilling light and laughter onto the porch. "Come back inside, you two," Martha called. "It's time for cider and carols." The moment broken, they returned to the warmth of the gathering. But throughout the evening, as voices raised in song and children dozed by the fire, Penelope caught Samuel watching her with an expression that made her wonder what might have happened had they not been interrupted. January brought the bitter heart of winter. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and temperatures fell so low that water froze in glasses indoors. Ranch work continued regardless. Cattle needed feeding, horses required care, and repairs couldn't wait for spring. Penelope's teaching expanded to include evening lessons for the ranch hands who wanted to improve their reading or mathematics. To her surprise, even some of the older men attended, shamefacedly admitting they'd never properly learned their letters. Never too old to learn, Samuel commented one evening after a particularly successful session where grizzled ranch hand Hank had finally mastered the multiplication tables. "That's something my father used to say." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Penelope replied as they walked back to her cabin through the crisp night air. The moon cast their shadows sharp and blue across the snow. "Taught me everything important: how to run a ranch, treat people fairly, work hard." Samuel hesitated. "Told me once that the measure of a man isn't what he owns but what he builds. Not just structures but relationships, community." They reached her cabin door, and as had become their custom, Samuel waited while Penelope lit her lamp before saying good night. But tonight he seemed reluctant to leave. "What is it?" she asked, noticing his hesitation. "There's a letter," he said finally. "Came with the mail delivery yesterday, from the school board in Sierra Vista." Penelope's heart skipped. "And the schoolhouse is finished. They want you to start official classes in town next month." He met her eyes steadily. "It's what you came here for, what Edward arranged." "Yes," she agreed softly, "it is." Samuel nodded once, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Well then, congratulations, Miss Forrester. You'll make a fine town teacher." He tipped his hat and turned to go. "Samuel," she called after him. When he turned back, she found herself without words for what she wanted to say. How could she explain that the prospect of leaving Circle C, of leaving him, filled her with a sense of loss far greater than what she'd felt leaving Boston? Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for everything." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You're welcome, Penny." Then he was gone, his tall figure quickly swallowed by the darkness. That night, Penelope lay awake, listening to the wind and turning over her options. The teaching position in town was what she had traveled across the country for. It offered independence, respectability, a fresh start. Yet the thought of leaving the ranch, of no longer seeing Samuel daily, created an ache in her chest that no amount of logical thinking could ease. In the morning, she made her decision. After breakfast, she asked Samuel to walk with her, leading him to the same overlook where they had stood that first day. "I've been thinking about the teaching position," she began. "It's a good opportunity," he said neutrally, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It is," she agreed. "But I've also been considering alternatives." This caught his attention. "What kind of alternatives?" "The children here need education too," she pointed out. "And the adults. We've already established a school of sorts. With your permission, I'd like to make it permanent, a proper school right here on Circle C, open to your ranch hands children and those from neighboring properties." Samuel turned to face her fully, hope and caution warring in his expression. "You'd stay here, rather than take the town position." "If you'll have me," Penelope said, her heart pounding. "The town can find another teacher, they have options, these children don't." "It's not just about the children, is it?" he asked quietly. Penelope took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "No, it's not." Samuel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "Then tell me the real reason, Penelope. I need to hear you say it." "Because this feels like home," she whispered. "Because I care for everyone here. Because I care for you, Samuel, in a way I never expected to care for anyone." The transformation of his expression was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual at first, then suddenly brilliant. His hands, work roughened but gentle, cradled her face. "I've been falling in love with you since you stepped off that stagecoach," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "Fighting it every step because I thought you'd leave come spring. Because I didn't think I had the right to ask you to stay in this hard country when you could have an easier life." "I don't want an easier life," Penelope said, covering his hands with her own. "I want this life, here, with you." His kiss was tentative at first, as if he feared she might change her mind. But when Penelope responded with all the feeling she'd kept contained for months, his hesitation vanished. His arms encircled her, pulling her close as the kiss deepened, warming them despite the winter chill. When they finally parted, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Wyoming winters are long and hard. The work never ends. It's not the life you were raised for." "Perhaps not," Penelope agreed, "but it's the life I choose." "I arrived on the last stage before winter, Samuel, expecting just to survive until spring. Instead, I found a home. I found you." He smiled then, the full, unguarded smile she'd seen so rarely. "Then stay, Penny. Stay and help me build something here. Something that will last beyond spring, beyond next winter, beyond all the seasons to come." As February gave way to March, signs of the approaching spring began to appear: longer daylight hours, the occasional warmer day that melted the surface snow before night froze it again, birds returning from their southern sojourns. With the change in seasons came changes to Circle C Ranch as well. The small building that had served as the makeshift schoolhouse was being expanded, with Samuel and the hands working in the evenings to add windows and proper desks. Word had spread about Penelope's teaching, and 3 more families from outlying homesteads had asked if their children could attend. "We'll need to add another room by fall," Samuel commented one evening as they reviewed the building plans at her cabin table. "Maybe hire an assistant for you if enrollment keeps growing." Penelope smiled, still adjusting to this new dynamic between them, the ease with which they now discussed future plans. The casual touches as they worked side by side, the understanding that whatever came, they would face it together. Their courtship had progressed quickly, but not recklessly. Samuel had formally asked for her hand in early February, presenting her with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a simple band of gold with a small sapphire that matched the blue of the Wyoming sky. "I want to do this properly," he'd said. "No rushing, no pressure. We can wait as long as you need." But Penelope, having already lost so much time to propriety and others' expectations, saw no reason to delay. They planned to marry in April, when the roads would be passable enough for the pastor to travel from town and for their scattered neighbors to attend. Martha had taken the news with barely disguised delight, immediately setting to work on wedding preparations. "About time," she'd muttered to George, not quite quietly enough. "Thought I'd have to lock them in the root cellar together to get them to admit what everyone else could see." Now, as Penelope reviewed her students' progress reports while Samuel sketched additions to the schoolhouse, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just a few short months. The scandal that had driven her from Boston, a false accusation of impropriety, with a married patron of the school where she taught now, seemed like something that had happened to someone else, in another lifetime. "Penny for your thoughts," Samuel said, looking up from his drawings with a smile at his own pun. She laughed, the sound still somewhat new to her ears. In Boston, she had been known for her reserve, her seriousness. Here, laughter came more easily every day. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if my uncle had lived, if the schoolhouse in town had been finished on time, if the stage had arrived before the first snow. If I hadn't been the one to meet you that day," Samuel added, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Sometimes the hardest beginnings lead to the best journeys." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. George stood outside, his expression grave. Ryder just came in from the south pasture. Ice on the rivers breaking up early, waters rising fast and headed this way. Samuel was immediately alert. "How much time do we have?" "Hours, not days. Need to move the herd to higher ground and secure everything that could wash away." "I'll be right there," Samuel turned to Penelope. "This could be bad. Spring floods usually come more gradually." "What can I do to help?" she asked, already reaching for her coat. His smile was quick but warm. "That's my girl. Help Martha get supplies to the second floor of the main house, just in case. Then start preparing the bunkhouse for the families from the lower cabins they may need to evacuate." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Ranch hands rode out to move cattle and horses to higher ground, while everyone else worked to secure equipment and move valuable supplies out of potential flood paths. By nightfall, the distant rumble of ice breaking and water rushing could be heard even from the ranch buildings. Penelope worked alongside Martha, preparing the main house to serve as a refuge if needed. They stocked the upper floor with food, water, medicine, and blankets, then did the same with the bunkhouse, which sat on slightly higher ground than some of the family cabins. Just before midnight, the first families began arriving from the lowest-lying cabins, the parents tense with worry, the children wide-eyed with excitement at the unusual night activity. Penelope organized them in the bunkhouse, setting up sleeping arrangements and trying to maintain a sense of calm. "Have you seen Samuel?" she asked George when he checked in shortly after midnight. "Still down by the river with some of the men, building berms to try to divert the water around the main buildings," he replied. "He sent me to tell you not to worry." But Penelope did worry, especially when the rain began, a cold, driving rain that would only accelerate the snowmelt and increase the flood danger. By dawn, the lower pastures were underwater, and the dirt road leading to the main house had become a shallow stream. When Samuel finally returned, he was soaked to the skin and exhausted, his face drawn with concern. "Water's still rising," he reported as Martha pressed hot coffee into his hands. "We've moved everything we can, but we're going to lose some of the outbuildings, maybe the lower cabins too." "The people are safe," Penelope reminded him. "That's what matters." He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as he looked at her. "You're right. It's just—" He gestured vaguely toward the window where the rain continued to fall. "This place is more than buildings," she said softly, understanding his unspoken worry. Circle C wasn't just land and structures to Samuel. It was his heritage, his father's legacy, the physical manifestation of generations of work and dreams. For 3 days the rain fell and the floodwaters rose. The lower cabins were indeed lost, along with one of the smaller barns and a workshop. But the main house remained dry, as did the bunkhouse, the main barn, and much to everyone's relief, the schoolhouse. On the 4th day, the rain stopped and the waters began to recede, leaving behind a mess of mud, debris, and damaged structures. As the ranch community surveyed the destruction, Penelope was struck by their resilience. There was disappointment, certainly, but no despair, just a practical assessment of what needed to be done and how quickly they could do it. "Could have been worse," George commented as they walked the property. "Remember the flood of '67? Samuel nodded grimly. "Lost half the herd that year and most of the buildings. Took Pa nearly 2 years to rebuild. We'll be back to normal by summer," George predicted confidently. "Sooner if the weather holds." The cleanup began immediately. Everyone able to work did so, from the oldest hands to the school-aged children, who were assigned lighter tasks appropriate to their ages. Penelope divided her time between continuing lessons for the children and helping with the recovery efforts, often ending her days so exhausted she fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. Through it all, Samuel was everywhere, directing repairs, salvaging what could be saved, planning rebuilding, encouraging those who had lost the most. Penelope watched him with growing admiration, seeing firsthand the leadership qualities that had earned him the respect of everyone on the ranch. "You're amazing," she told him one evening as they collapsed together on the porch steps of the main house, too tired even to make it inside for dinner. "I don't know how you keep going," he shrugged, but she could see he was pleased by her praise. "It's my responsibility. These people depend on me." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. "Soon they'll depend on us." The simple statement, acknowledging her future place as his wife and partner in running Circle C, filled Penelope with a quiet joy. In Boston, she had been valued primarily for her family connections and her ability to maintain proper appearances. Here, she was valued for her actual contributions, her intelligence, her willingness to work alongside everyone else. As April arrived and the land began to dry out, preparations for the wedding resumed. The date had been pushed back slightly to accommodate the flood recovery, but with most of the essential repairs completed, Samuel and Penelope decided not to wait any longer. "Life will always throw challenges our way," Samuel reasoned. "If we wait for the perfect moment, we might wait forever." The wedding was set for the third Saturday in April, a simple ceremony to be held in the newly repaired main barn, which could accommodate all of Circle C's residents plus the neighbors and townspeople who had been invited. The week before the wedding brought unexpected news: a letter from Boston, forwarded from the Sierra Vista post office. Penelope recognized the handwriting immediately. Helen Blackwood, her closest friend from her teaching days at the Stratford School for Young Ladies. She opened it with trembling fingers, half afraid of what it might contain. Had the scandal followed her even here? But the letter held only good news. The man who had accused Penelope of impropriety had recanted, admitting he had invented the story out of spite when she had rejected his advances. Her name had been cleared, and the Stratford School had offered to reinstate her with a formal apology and increased salary. "I thought you would want to know," Helen wrote. "You could come home now, Penelope. All is forgiven." Penelope sat for a long time with the letter in her lap, unexpected tears blurring her vision. After all this time, to be vindicated, to know that she could return to Boston with her head held high. Samuel found her there an hour later, still holding the letter. "What is it?" he asked, immediately concerned by her tears. "Bad news." "No," she said, handing him the letter. "Actually, it's good news, very good news." He read it quickly, his expression growing still. When he looked up, his eyes held a question he was afraid to ask. "You could go back," he said simply. "I could," Penelope agreed. Rising, she moved to the small writing desk in the corner of her cabin and pulled out a sheet of paper. Dipping her pen in ink, she began to write. Samuel watched her in silence, his body tense with uncertainty. "Dear Helen," Penelope read aloud as she wrote, "thank you for your letter and the welcome news it contains. While I am grateful for the vindication and the Stratford School's offer, I must decline. I have found my place here in Wyoming territory, not just a position, but a true home, a community, and a love I never expected to find. Please tell the school board I appreciate their offer, but my teaching days in Boston are behind me. I am to be married on April 18th to the finest man I have ever known, and together we are building something wonderful here on the frontier." She continued writing for several minutes while Samuel stood motionless, watching her with growing wonder. When she finished, she sanded the paper, folded it, and sealed it with a drop of wax. "You're staying," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even though you could go back to your old life, clear your name, have everything you left behind." Penelope crossed the room to him, taking his hands in hers. "Samuel Caldwell, when will you understand? I don't want my old life. What I have here, what we are building together, is worth more than any position or social standing in Boston." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly. Afraid that given the choice, you'd realize what you've given up to be here. I haven't given up anything important, Penelope assured him. I've only gained purpose, respect, love. Real love, Samuel, the kind that lasts through winter and beyond. Their wedding day dawned clear and surprisingly warm, as if nature itself approved of their union. The barn had been transformed with wildflowers gathered from the hills and ribbons saved from Christmas packages. Lanterns hung from the rafters, ready to be lit as the day progressed into evening celebrations. Penelope prepared in the main house with Martha's help, dressing in a gown that was another of Emma's treasures, an ivory silk that Martha had carefully altered to fit Penelope's slighter frame. Her auburn hair was arranged simply, adorned only with a crown of spring blossoms. "You look beautiful," Martha said, blinking back tears as she adjusted the final details. "Samuel won't know what hit him, do you think?" Penelope hesitated, then continued in a rush. "Do you think Emma would mind? That I'm wearing her dress, marrying her husband?" Martha's expression softened. Emma loved Samuel something fierce, but she'd have hated seeing him alone all these years. She'd want him to be happy. She squeezed Penelope's hand. "And she'd have liked you, girl. You've got the same spirit, practical but kind, strong when needed." Reassured, Penelope took a deep breath and prepared to meet her future. Outside, the gathered community waited, ranch hands and their families, neighbors from nearby spreads, townspeople from Sierra Vista who had made the journey despite the still muddy roads. Samuel stood at the far end of the barn beside the pastor, looking more nervous than Penelope had ever seen him. He had traded his usual working clothes for a formal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his dark hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. When Penelope appeared in the barn doorway, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the gathered guests. But Penelope saw only Samuel, whose expression transformed from nervousness to awe as she walked toward him on George's arm. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged the traditional vows, their voices steady with conviction. When the pastor finally pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel's kiss was both tender and promising, drawing good-natured cheers from their guests. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, a joyous blend of feast and dance, with music provided by ranch hands who produced fiddles, harmonicas, and even a small accordion. Penelope danced until her feet ached, not just with Samuel but with George, with the older ranch hands who taught her frontier dances she'd never seen in Boston ballrooms, and with the children who insisted their teacher join their chaotic circles. As midnight approached, Samuel found her sitting on a hay bale, catching her breath between dances. He offered his hand with a smile that still made her heart skip. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Caldwell?" The name, her new name, sent a thrill through her. "You may indeed, Mr. Caldwell." He led her not to the crowded dance floor but outside, where the spring night was cool and clear, stars speckling the vast Wyoming sky. No music reached them here except the distant fiddle and the closer songs of night insects awakening after winter's long silence. "Happy?" Samuel asked as they swayed together, more holding each other than truly dancing. "Completely," Penelope assured him, resting her head against his chest. "Are you?" His arms tightened around her. "More than I ever thought possible again." He tilted her chin up, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I want you to know something, Penny. What I feel for you, it doesn't diminish what Emma and I had. It's not a replacement. It's something new, something different but equally precious." "I know," she said softly. "Love isn't a limited resource, Samuel. It grows to fill whatever space we make for it." He smiled at that, the smile that still made her breath catch the one that reached his eyes and softened the hard angles of his face. "When did you get so wise, schoolteacher?" "I had an excellent teacher myself," Penelope replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "A certain rancher who showed me what really matters." Their first months of marriage passed in a blur of work and joy as spring firmly established itself across the Wyoming landscape. The flood damage was repaired, new cabins built to replace those lost, and the expanded schoolhouse completed in time for summer lessons. Penelope's school flourished, drawing students from an ever-widening area as word spread of the quality of education available at Circle C Ranch. By June, she had indeed hired an assistant, a young woman from Sierra Vista with a year of college education, who was eager to learn Penelope's teaching methods. Samuel, meanwhile, expanded the ranch's operations, investing in better breeding stock and implementing some of the newer farming techniques he'd read about in his agricultural journals. Circle C prospered under their combined leadership, becoming known throughout the territory not just as a successful cattle operation, but as a community where education and innovation were valued. Their personal happiness matched their professional success. Marriage suited them both, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Samuel's practical knowledge balanced Penelope's book learning, her optimism tempered his occasional brooding, his steadiness anchored her when she doubted herself. By their first anniversary, Penelope had news to share, news she'd suspected for weeks, but had only recently confirmed with Martha's experienced assessment. "A baby," Samuel repeated when she told him, his expression transforming from shock to wonder to pure joy in the space of seconds. "We're having a baby in late autumn, according to Martha's calculations," Penelope confirmed, laughing as he lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "Careful, I'm in a delicate condition, or so I'm told." He set her down gently, his hands still spanning her waist. "Are you feeling well? Should you be resting? Do we need to send for the doctor in town?" "Samuel," she interrupted his flow of concerned questions with a smile. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, often under far less favorable conditions than these." His expression sobered slightly. "I know, it's just Emma." He didn't need to finish the thought. "I'm not Emma," Penelope said gently. "And this isn't then. Martha has delivered dozens of babies safely, and we can have the doctor from town for the birth if it eases your mind." Samuel placed a hand on her still flat stomach, his touch reverent. "A child," he murmured. "Our child." The months that followed were busy ones, as they prepared not only for the coming baby but for another Wyoming winter. This time, Penelope faced the approach of cold weather without fear, secure in her place at Circle C and in Samuel's love. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly, though by late summer she had reluctantly handed most of her teaching duties to her assistant, Jenny. Samuel hovered protectively, constantly finding excuses to check on her during the day and refusing to travel far from the ranch as her time grew nearer. "You're making everyone nervous with all your pacing," Penelope teased him one October evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "Can't help it," he admitted. "Never thought I'd have this chance again, a family of my own." Penelope took his hand, placing it where their child had just kicked vigorously. "Feel that? That's one strong child. Our son or daughter is going to be just fine." Samuel's smile was tender as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "With you as a mother, how could they be anything else?" Their son, Edward Samuel Caldwell, arrived on a clear November night with much less drama than his father had feared. The birth was quick and uncomplicated, with Martha's skilled hands guiding the baby into the world while Samuel paced the hallway outside. alternately praying and making bargains with God. When Martha finally called him in, the sight of Penelope propped against pillows, tired but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket, stopped Samuel in his tracks. "Come meet your son," Penelope invited, her voice soft with wonder. Samuel approached cautiously, as if afraid the scene might vanish if he moved too quickly. When Penelope placed the baby in his arms, his hands shook slightly before steadying. "He's perfect," he whispered, staring down at the tiny red face with its shock of dark hair. "Hello, Edward. I'm your pa." The baby yawned, his miniature fist escaping the blanket to wave randomly in the air. Samuel caught it gently with one finger, marveling at the perfect tiny nails, the delicate creases of knuckles no bigger than grains of rice. "Thank you," he said to Penelope, his voice thick with emotion. "For him, for everything." She smiled tiredly. "Thank you for offering warmth when I needed it most, Samuel, for giving me a home, a purpose, a family." Little Edward thrived through his first winter, growing stronger each day under the doting attention of not just his parents but the entire ranch community. Martha appointed herself unofficial grandmother. George taught the baby to grip his finger with surprising strength, and even the most weathered ranch hands could be seen making faces and cooing nonsense when they thought no one was watching. By spring, Penelope had returned to limited teaching duties, often with Edward napping in a basket beside her desk, or being passed among the older girls who delighted in caring for the ranch baby. The school continued to grow, attracting students from as far as 15 miles away, some staying at the ranch during the week because the daily journey was too arduous. As Edward's first birthday approached, Samuel and Penelope discussed expanding their family further. "Not too soon," Penelope cautioned. "I'd like Edward to be walking properly first." "Whenever you're ready," Samuel agreed easily. "Though I admit I like the idea of a little girl with your hair and smile." "Or another boy to run the ranch with his brother someday," Penelope suggested, watching as Edward practiced pulling himself up on a chair, his determined expression so like his father's it made her heart squeeze with love. "Either way," Samuel said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they observed their son's efforts. "We're building something here, Penny, something that will last generations." Penelope leaned back against his solid warmth, thinking of how far they had come since that snowy day when she'd stepped off the stagecoach, alone and afraid. "I never imagined this life," she admitted. "Never dreamed I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Samuel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not after Emma. I thought that part of my life was over. And now," his arms tightened around her, "now I thank God every day for sending you on that last stage before winter. For giving me a second chance at love, a love that will last beyond all the springs to come." Edward chose that moment to take his first independent step, wobbling precariously, before plopping down on his well-padded bottom with a look of surprised outrage that made both his parents laugh. As Samuel scooped him up for a congratulatory cuddle, Penelope watched her family with a heart so full it seemed impossible it wouldn't overflow. She had arrived in Sierra Vista with nothing but a trunk of impractical clothing and fading hopes. She had found not just shelter from the storm, but a love that had transformed her life completely. Together, she and Samuel had built a home, a family, and a future as vast and promising as the Wyoming sky above them. And as Edward giggled in his father's arms and the spring breeze carried the scent of new beginnings through the open window, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that the warmth Samuel had offered that first cold day would indeed last not just beyond spring, but for all the seasons of their lives.